In the 1800s, families across England were slowly poisoning their children inside their own homes. The worst part, they picked it willingly. Imagine this, it's the early 1860s in Limehouse, East London. Damp walls, narrow rooms, a place where sunlight barely touches the floor and moisture never leaves. A family lives here. They are not reckless. They are trying to improve their home, the same way millions of people were doing across Victorian England. So, they decorate, they save what little money they can, and buy something fashionable, something admired, something that promises to make their home feel brighter. A rich, glowing emerald green wallpaper. And when it goes up, it transforms the room. Even on grey days, the walls glimmer, the room feels alive. The children love it. They play beneath those walls for hours, laughing, running, tracing the patterns, as if they are part of the room itself. For a while, everything feels better, until it doesn't. At first, it's barely noticeable. The house feels more silent some days. Nothing dramatic, just something off. Days pass, weeks, and things slip further. The parents begin to worry. A doctor is called, but nothing makes sense. There is no spoiled food, no contaminated water, no known illness moving through the neighborhood. Just a slow, quiet change, creeping in without warning. Cases like this were suspected and reported across England. Families sometimes watched their children grow weaker inside the very rooms meant to protect them. The danger wasn't outside, not in the streets, not even something you could lock the door against. It was already inside, lurking within the walls. That beautiful green wallpaper, the one chosen with care, may have been part of the problem. And that's what you are about to discover. The story about how something ordinary, something desirable, something trusted was quietly making people sick, while almost no one realized it. But how could something like this go on for years? To answer that, you have to step into a very specific moment in history, Victorian England, a time when everything was changing. Industry was accelerating. Factories were producing goods faster than ever before. New materials, new dyes, new colors were flooding the market. One color stood out, a vivid green that almost seemed alive. That color traces back to 1775. It was made using a chemical process that produced an unusually bright result. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. At the time, it seemed like a breakthrough, bringing modern exciting color into everyday life. And that belief would change everything. By the early 1800s, a new version appeared, even brighter, more durable, and more striking. Paris green, also known as Schweinfurt green. Once it hit the market, there was no turning back. Manufacturers embraced it. Designers loved it. Consumers demanded it. Suddenly, green was everywhere. Wallpaper production surged across Britain. Factories were producing tens of millions of rolls each year. Homes were being transformed at every level of society. Wealthy families covered entire parlors in lush green patterns. Middle-class households followed, papering bedrooms, hallways, even nurseries, and even in poorer homes, where space was tight and the walls were often damp. Some families bought just a single roll to brighten a corner of their home. But here is the twist most people missed. That green didn't stay on the walls. It spread into dresses, artificial flowers, ribbons, children's toys. Imagine a child surrounded by green, walls, clothes and toys. To the Victorians, this wasn't alarming. It was modern. It was progress. Like any powerful trend, it became a status symbol. The brighter your walls, the more fashionable your home. The more vivid the green, the more it signaled taste, wealth and awareness. Everyone wanted that color. But while homes were becoming brighter, something else was quietly building in the background. Something invisible, something deadly. And the warning signs, they were already there. People simply didn't put the pieces together. It doesn't announce itself, not at first. It builds slowly, quietly, and it depends on something almost every Victorian home had. You had to picture the environment. In places like Limehouse, many homes were poorly ventilated. Walls absorbed moisture from the outside air. Windows stayed shut. Coal fires filled rooms with soot and residue. And over time, that moisture settled into the wallpaper, and something subtle but deadly began to happen. The pigments used in those bright green wallpapers contained arsenic compounds. At the time, many believed those compounds were stable, locked safely into the color, harmless once applied. But that assumption didn't always hold. In damp conditions, the wallpaper could begin to break down. So slowly you wouldn't notice it. Tiny particles loosened. Moisture and mold could release arsenic into the air. Not something you could clearly see, not something you could easily smell, but something you could breathe, day after day, night after night. Now, imagine living there. At first, nothing is obvious. There's just the heaviness in the room, a fatigue that never leaves. Then it passes, and you ignore it. That's what made it so difficult to recognize, because the exposure wasn't constant. It shifted depending on humidity, temperature, and airflow. Some days, everything feels normal. Other days, something feels wrong. And then it fades again. No clear pattern, no obvious cause. Until slowly, a pattern begins to form anyway, enough to make people uneasy. Certain rooms feel worse than others. Certain houses seem to have the same problems. Certain wallpapers keep appearing in those spaces. Could it really be the walls? It doesn't make sense. Wallpaper is decoration. It's supposed to improve your home, not harm you. And yet, the pattern keeps repeating across different homes, different parts of the country. And once enough people begin asking that question, it stops sounding ridiculous. And that's the moment everything begins to change. But here is where the story takes a frustrating turn. Because even as the patterns become clearer, not everyone is willing to accept it. By the mid-19th century, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Doctors had started to notice it. Not everywhere, but enough to raise questions. They began documenting cases. Homes where something felt consistently wrong. Rooms where people seemed to decline, then improve, depending on where they spent their time. They started pointing to a possibility that sounded almost unthinkable. You would think a warning like that would spark action immediately, but that's not what happened. Instead, it was met with resistance, fierce resistance. At this point, the wallpaper industry wasn't just popular, it was massive. Factories were producing at scale, designers were building reputations, retailers were making steady profits. Entire livelihoods depended on it. When something is that massive, change is almost impossible. Manufacturers defended their products. Some argued that the pigments were safe under normal conditions. Some dismissed it as coincidence or hysteria. From their perspective, the evidence was unclear, inconsistent, and the cause unknown. This made it easy to doubt, easy to delay, easy to dismiss. But then, the debate reached someone whose voice carried weight, someone influential, someone trusted, William Morris. Morris was one of the most respected designers of the time. His wallpaper patterns helped define Victorian interiors. His work was admired, widely used, deeply influential. So when concerns began to spread, people looked to voices like his, expecting caution, expecting a warning. But that's not what they got. Morris fired back. He challenged the claims, questioned the evidence, criticized what he saw as exaggerated fear. To him, the idea that wallpaper, something so widely used, so carefully crafted, could be quietly harming people didn't seem convincing. It wasn't indifference, it was conviction in the craft. But that belief was everything, because when someone everyone trusts dismisses danger, everyone else followed. Manufacturers felt justified. Customers felt reassured. Doubt got pushed aside. And while that debate played out, the reality wasn't the same for everyone. Families in the poorest homes faced the highest risk. Their experiences often went unheard. Meanwhile, in wealthier homes, the trend continued. Bright green stayed in style, desired, a symbol of taste, wealth, and progress. So even as concern grew, demand didn't disappear. But something had started to shift. Because once an idea enters public awareness, it doesn't stay contained. Newspapers began reporting on unexplained illness linked to interiors. People began connecting experiences, and slowly, doubts began to grow again. People started looking at their homes differently, looking at their walls differently, and asking a question they were afraid to answer. What if the very thing we trust is the problem? And once enough people started to ask that question, the balance began to shift. Because now, the issue isn't just scientific, it's personal. And when something becomes personal, change is only a matter of time. But even then, it didn't happen fast enough. By the 1870s, of course, the pressure had been building for years. Manufacturers began adapting. Some companies started promoting arsenic-free wallpapers, advertising them as safe alternatives. Washable and hygienic became reassurance, not just marketing. They became a way to rebuild trust without admitting everything at once. Top designers slowly adopted safer methods. New pigments entered the market, close enough to replace the old, and slowly, the brightest greens vanished from homes. Not banned in a single moment or removed by one decisive law, but replaced. People stopped trusting them, and then the factories followed suit. By the late 19th century, the widespread use of arsenic in household decorative materials had declined significantly. Not completely gone, but no longer dominant. But here is the part that doesn't stay in the past. Even today, pieces of that history are still being uncovered. In older homes across England, renovations sometimes reveal layers of wallpaper beneath newer designs. And sometimes, those layers still hide the same deadly green. We now test these materials carefully. When arsenic is present, they are handled with strict precautions, not because standing near is immediately dangerous, but because under the right conditions, especially if disturbed or deteriorating, it can still pose a risk. A pristine Victorian room, perfect, but hiding a poison from the past. And when you look back at those families, like the ones in places such as Limehouse, the story feels different. They weren't careless, they weren't reckless. They were just like us today, trying to make their homes brighter, more comfortable, more beautiful. They chose something admired, something trusted, something everyone else was using. And for some, that trust came at a cost. And that's what makes this story linger. Not just the poison itself, but how long it took for people to truly question it. Once they did, it became a problem solved. And here is the part that should stay with you. The details may be different today, but the pattern isn't. Often, the greatest risk is the one we ignore. In the next video, we will uncover another ordinary object that quietly affected families in ways no one expected.